Hey, Jeff, do you like to fly?
I want to know the person who does enjoy flying today because to me it's kind of a miserable experience. Not that like I guess I'll reframe this. I'm astounded that we can fly, that it's really easy for us to fly. And if I wanted to take a plane from where I'm at here in Portland over to, let's say, Amsterdam, where there's a direct flight to, that's a 10-hour trip. I wake up one morning and the other, by the end of the day, I'm on the other side of the world. That's an astounding fact. The fact that that exists is kind of incredible. The experience of flying leaves a lot to be desired. I don't really like to be, crammed into the, was it like a tuna can sort of situation
Yeah.
with a bunch of, like not a lot of leg room, the whole process of getting on. It's very, stressful. So I like that I can travel. I wouldn't say I like flying.
I'm guessing there are many listeners who probably share those two opinions, and I've got some version of that myself. I think it's amazing that we can get around the world so quickly, but it's not always something I'm always looking forward to. I'd like to get there a lot of times because of all the things that you described. And so today's episode is Geography's Air Travel. So we're going to talk about flying and the history of flying a little bit, the contemporary situation, and throughout the episode we'll also talk about people's attitudes towards flying and flight as well, because this is something that I think has been in the imagination of human beings for a very long time, although we've only been able to fly pretty recently in human history.
Yeah. It's interesting, thinking about the contemporary sort of history of air travel, right? Airplanes. It's also interesting thinking about how it's evolved from, let's say, 1960s to today. There's these images and you can find these videos online of, traveling during that period of time where, people are dressed up for it. They're in suits. There's a lot of people on these planes, but it doesn't look uncomfortable necessarily. It doesn't look like people are cramming onto it. It just seems like a wholly different experience between, basically over the last 50 years to where we're at now. And I'm assuming a lot of that is just due to the economics of the situation.
Yeah, and we'll track that particularly over the 20th century because the changes were so rapid in the 20th century with flight technology. And there are a number of different eras in terms of comfort and who was able to fly and who could afford to fly. So we'll definitely be tracking that stuff. The history of human flight and aviation, as I found out during research, is pretty vast. There's a lot to say, but as usual, we'll focus on some of the highlights. We can't cover everything, but we'll try to do the topic justice. Some initial terminology for you here, listener: a lighter than air machine and a heavier than air machine. So a lighter than air machine would be something that flies because, for example, hot air balloon or something that's filled with helium is lighter than air and rises and becomes buoyant because of that. And then there are heavier than air machines like airplanes and helicopters, which use engines to power through the air. So that's some terminology that will come up. And I found this in a lot of stuff I was reading. And so let's step way back for a second. And so let's start talking about some of the mythologies that are around flying that have been around for a long time. If we look, for example, in Greek mythology, we can see Bellerophon the Valiant captured Pegasus to battle the Chimera. So that's this dream of somebody flying on a winged horse. There's Icarius and Daedalus. They were father and son. They escaped from imprisonment with wings made of wax and feathers. Daedalus.
Oh, that's the one where it's like, don't fly too close to the sun or something like that.
That's the lesson here.
It's become an idiom or something.
No, that's exactly right. So Daedalus, who is the father, he flew the way that, in a safe way, I guess, and made it from Crete to where he was imprisoned to Naples. But his son, Icarius, flew too high and too near the sun, and the wings melted and he fell to his death. So yeah, that becomes a metaphor for all kinds of things. But that's, and there's a lot of that happened in the history of flight, like things not working out. In Persia, King Kajkuz attached eagles to his throne, the legend says, and flew throughout his kingdom. This probably didn't happen. Alexander the Great attached 4 griffins, which are part eagle and part lion, to a basket and took flight. Those animals don't even really exist, so that probably didn't happen either. But the point is, if we go throughout the world, we can find different examples of people imagining what it would be like to fly.
Yeah, I think there's always been a fascination. I think naturally, as humans started, understanding their place in the world, they also started, noticing, hey, there are these things called birds that are
Yes.
flying around. And I think that immediately sparks the initial fascination with, well, why can't we do that? Right. I mean, I think the father and son example you're using, I think, is a perfect example, right? They're literally attaching feathers and wings onto their bodies in some capacity, yeah, according to the myth.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will see some examples. I'll mention a few examples of people trying exactly that. But I think you're right that people saw birds and say, "Hey, I can probably do that," right? And a lot of the first attempts were related to trying to create a flying device where you flapped your arms or you flapped wings, kind of like a bird. And of course, airplanes don't do that, but we'll get to that. The first
Right.
Perhaps the first evidence of people engaging in flying things may have been kites, which date back to at least 400 BCE in China. So people have been flying kites in China for a very long time. And people at this point must be imagining human flight as well. I think flying kites also is something that arose in Japan. Some of these legends suggest some of these kites may have carried people. This appears to be unknown and probably unlikely. But you can go back a couple thousand years and people are thinking, maybe I can get up there. Maybe I can find a way to fly.
I would be surprised if they managed to get somebody up on a kite. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm too tainted by my own interpretation of what a kite is.
Right.
Have like a thing on a string, sort of
Right.
floating in
Like
the
the one you
sky.
fly at the beach, you're not getting up on, that's not happening.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but the point is there's limits to our ability to know things. So I don't want to say it didn't happen. I'm suggesting that we don't really know and it doesn't necessarily add up, but who knows? Maybe this actually happened. And then, as you said, Jeff, wings. Right? People are like, let's put on some wings because the birds have wings. And if I had wings, I could fly. And it sort of makes sense. However, it's not ended very well for people who've tried to do this because it's just, they can't make it happen. Right. You can't flap your
I
arms and there's the dynamics don't really allow for that.
Right, and I think birds have like hollower bones, lighter bones that we just don't have.
And they have
But I think
tails, which
like
are important for flying too. So that's a thing a
they
lot
have
of people left
tails,
out.
right?
Yeah.
Right, like all of our airplanes today, they have basically tails
Yep.
that help
That's
that
right.
whole situation.
Apparently really
No,
helpful
I
for
imagine.
landing. Yep.
Yeah, I imagine that far beyond what any sort of written history has, there is probably a sort of probably gruesome history of failures in people trying to fly and people thinking that maybe they have the formula right and they're going to be the one to do it, and it not working out for them, and therefore they probably didn't survive.
A lot of people lost their lives trying to advance this idea of human flight. And we'll mention this a little bit. We'll try not to dwell on that too much,
Mhm.
but a lot of that went on, certainly, as you expect it might with, if you're in a car and you break down and you get in an accident, you have maybe a chance to survive. But if you're up in the air and you start free falling, you're kind of done, right? There's not much you can do about that. One of the people I'm sure you've heard of, Leonardo da Vinci, who lived from 1452 to 1519, and was famous in his day, and I think today for being a painter primarily. But had all kinds of different interests. And several hundred years after his death, around little after 1800, some of his notebooks were discovered. I don't know who had them and why they were hiding them, but they came to light. And some 500 sketches and 4,500 words about the flight of birds and flying machines were created by Da Vinci, speculating on how this might work. And some of these designs were ornithopters. You know what an ornithopter is?
Kind of sounds like a helicopter to me.
It is, but it's one where there's the flapping of wings, apparently.
Oh,
So
okay,
that
cool,
would
right on.
that's the idea. I
I
think
think I've seen some of these sketches before. I mean, as you're saying this, I can
yes.
kind of imagine sort of like a drawing of some of these. Maybe one kind of looks like a little bit like a corkscrew kind of
Yeah,
thing.
that's
I
the
don't know.
one that sort of looks like a helicopter and or an ornithopter perhaps. And it turns out that none of these were very forward thinking, but none of these were scientifically feasible and probably were never made. And if they were, it probably didn't work out. So, you have somebody who's ahead of their time in imagining what could happen, but the science isn't there to support and to realize the kinds of diagrams that he was putting together for this. So we get into slightly more recent history, and by that I mean like the industrial period. The people first achieved flight probably through balloons,
Oh, right. That makes sense.
right? And
Yeah.
balloons have been around a bit longer than airplanes have. So the big challenge, though, with balloons is that they aren't really steerable. So balloons travel in the direction of the wind. And if one is an experienced pilot, you can change altitudes a bit to try to catch winds in one direction or the other. There's not a whole lot you can do to steer a balloon if the wind wants to take you in a particular direction. And there's one year in particular, which was a real banner year for innovations in balloons, and that was 1783. And this all took place in France.
Hmm.
So in June of 1783, the first recorded flight of an untethered hot air balloon were innovated by Joseph Michel Montgolfier and his brother Jacques Etienne. So they invented this balloon, untethered, nobody in it, and that worked. And so there was a follow-up to that. And incidentally, the way it worked is that smoke from a fire blew into a silk bag attached to a basket. The hot air was lighter than air and could thus rise above the ground. A little bit later that year, the Montgolfier put a sheep, a rooster, and a duck into a basket, which reached 6,000 feet and traveled over a mile. So again, part of this human tradition of getting animals to experiment things. Apparently the animals all survived. I don't know why the duck didn't maybe just fly away at the very beginning, because I think they're capable of doing that. Maybe the chicken could have jumped out too. I'm not sure if the sheep could see outside the basket. But anyways, apparently they were okay. In August of that year, 1783, Jacques Charles and the Robert brothers launched a hydrogen-filled balloon in Paris. And apparently neither people or farm animals were on board for that particular experiment. And then in October, the Montgolfier once again launched a tethered balloon with 3 people inside of it. Neither of them, but 3 people were inside, but it was tethered so they could just pull it back if they needed to. And then in November, the Montgolfier launched a untethered balloon with 2 people inside that traveled 5 miles in 25 minutes. So that's a pretty giant accomplishment, right?
That's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of sounding to me like the Montgolfiers are the Wright brothers of the balloon,
Yeah,
of the hot air balloon, right?
I think you
Like
could
they're
sort of say that. But there were a lot of other competition at the time, just like the Wright brothers. So that tracks pretty well, I think. And of course, not to be outdone, on December 1st, Charles and Nicolas Louis Robert of the Robert brothers took off together in a hydrogen balloon from Paris in front of 400,000 people. They hit 1,800 feet and traveled 22 miles in just over 2 hours. So that was like, I don't know, 10 days later or something like that, they were able to have an even longer flight that reached higher altitude. And then apparently, and I read this, that Robert gets out of the balloon and Charles decides to take a solo flight to nearly 10,000 feet of altitude. And remember, he's in an open basket.
that's
And
high.
that's super high. So he had terrible pain in his ears, which convinced him that he should probably never do this again, apparently. So
I do wonder if,
it's probably cold.
obviously, yeah, probably very cold. We go up in altitude or a significant degree, and there's a certain amount of depressurization
That's
or
right.
pressurization that we have to release. And I think a lot of humans at this point are sort of attuned to that because we can travel over fast or over large distances relatively quickly, or even just driving over a mountain. It can be done in an hour or two. But during this time, that would have been a much slower process. So I wonder if like the pain in his ears was just pressure that he didn't know how to deal with, because maybe you never had that experience
Should have
during that
brought
period
gum,
of time.
maybe? I don't know. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And if you're hiking, it's a more gradual ascent, and you can probably, even then you can get that pressure. But if you're going
Totally.
up quickly in a balloon or some kind of machine, it's a different situation. Have you ever been in a hot air balloon, Jeff?
Oh, no way. No, I don't like heights. I'm not. No. I don't do that. I'm not gonna bungee jump. I'm not gonna take a skydiving thing. Not just plainly not for me.
Yeah,
That's okay. I'm fine with that.
I'm also on board with not trying those things. I will say that I have sort of had an experience in a hot air balloon in high school. After graduation, one of my friend's parents had access to a hot air balloon that was tethered in somebody's backyard. So we were able to get in and go a little bit in the air, and we weren't free flying, but it was a little bit of taste of what was going on. But I'm not sure. I think that's probably good, for me as well.
Yeah.
I need that.
I will say though, like I would love to, I don't know if I would do it. I probably wouldn't, but I would love to visit, I think it's Albuquerque, New Mexico at the time when they have their hot air balloon festival. And there's just hundreds of these bad boys sort of going up into the sky. And they're all very vibrant, beautiful colors. I've seen some videos and images of it, and it looks really spectacular.
I would love to appreciate from the ground as well, I think. And I've seen images of this as well. And I think this must be an annual event. And I will also mention about balloons that during the US Civil War, the Union Army manned, and remember, these are non-steerable balloons to conduct reconnaissance on Confederate troops. And this follows in the sort of longstanding tradition that people have of harnessing new technologies for military purposes. And that's not the last time we'll mention that in this episode either. All right, so the next era of air travel or experimenting with air travel were something called airships, which are sometimes known as dirigibles, which means they're steerable. So they're different from balloons in that you can steer them. And so they've probably got some power behind them in order they can be directed in different ways. The first known powered dirigible took flight in 1852. Henri Giffard piloted a steam engine powered craft 15 miles. This, again,
That sounds cool.
It sounds cool and very steampunk. Jeff, I'm thinking a steampunk episode's got to be in our future because this sort of kind of thing comes up once in a while and it captures the imagination. So it's steam engine powered airship.
It absolutely needs to be a future episode. It'll be one, I think it has a fun sort of mythos attached to it, steampunk sort of culture, but it's also rooted very much in history.
That's right.
There was definitely a period of time that was very steampunk.
Yeah, no, there's the fantasy element to it, the literary and the, lived sort of embracing of that attitude and that aesthetic. But it was also a thing, steam power, and that would be a great episode. So we have to do it. We're committing to it right now. So in 1884, the French army launched La France, which is a 170-foot long dirigible with an 8.5 horsepower electric motor that went 5 miles in 23 minutes. So that's pretty solid speed. And these are, when we're talking about lighter than air aircraft, we're talking about two different varieties, the rigid and the non-rigid. So rigid ones would be more like balloons where there's no internal structure in the balloon. It's filled with air and that's what's used. But there are other kinds of airships that do use the rigid frame that we'll talk about in a moment. But another non-rigid airship are probably they're generally better known as blimps, right? The Goodyear blimp. You've heard of this, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
the Goodyear blimp, hallmark of Americana at this point.
Right. And also it shows that if people learn to fly, they're thinking, how can we advertise in the air? Because that's kind of what that is.
Right. I mean, and that idea, advertising in the sky, I think is very common along popular beaches around the world too, right? You have the little single prop plane, sort of like a banner. It's sort of like floating along.
Eat at Joe's, whatever.
Call this number.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, we use flight. We harnessed it pretty quickly for military purposes and for commercials. In 1901, Alberto Santos Dumont of Brazil, who was living in Paris at the time, created a blimp with an internal combustion engine. And so he was a pioneer in the lighter than air category, but also worked on heavier than aircraft, which we generally refer to as airplanes. And there's some speculation he had claimed to have I think in the early 1900s, before the Wright brothers conducted the first airplane flight, although it's the Wright brothers usually get credit for this. Another person who contended to have the first flight was Gustav Whitehead in 1901, a German engineer who immigrated to the United States and claimed to have flown an engine-powered flying machine near Fairfield, Connecticut, to get our Connecticut reference in. Another completing claim for the first flight of a heavier than air flight machine. I think this is a very early example of photos or it didn't happen. So people are like, well, how do we know? I mean, you could just be saying.
Right.
And there was some footage of the Wright brothers. And then there was some speculations the way the Wright brothers launched their plane was a little bit different than starting from a dead stop. And so there's some debate, although most of the sources that you're going to look at are going to say it's the Wright brothers who first flew. There's a lot more to say, but we have to take a short break.
All right, let's hit our first ad break and we will be right back.
And we're back. It's the Geography is Everything podcast. And today we're talking about geography is air travel. We've been talking about balloons, we've been talking about blimps, and now we're going to continue to talk about airships, but we're talking about rigid airships, which are usually filled with either hydrogen or helium or something called Blau gas, which is, I don't think, not used anymore, as an artificial gas similar to propane. And this is what it uses to become airborne. The best known kind of rigid airships are known as Zeppelins.
Oh, yeah. I know what a Zeppelin
right?
is.
You've heard of Zeppelin.
I know what a Led Zeppelin is.
Right. Funny.
No,
I want to get back to that in just a second, to the Led Zeppelin thing, because I felt like I had to do a little research on Led Zeppelin to round out the Zeppelin part of this presentation, this part of the show. The German, it's named Zeppelin after the inventor, who is Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin from Germany, who developed the design in the 1890s and conducted the first flights in 1900. So Zeppelins flew before airplanes flew. And beginning in 1910, and this is really interesting, the Zeppelin Airship Travel Company was founded by von Zeppelin, and it flew commercial flights. So the first airlines ran Zeppelins.
Were these, well, a couple questions. These were primarily hydrogen powered, right? Or filled?
I believe they were, or this Blau gas, which there's a process of capturing it and then liquefying it and turning it back into a gas. One of the things that was happening in the 1900s, particularly in between the wars, was that the United States had a lot of helium supply and refused to ship it to Germany. So sometimes, although helium was intended to be used, hydrogen was chosen because that's what they had access to.
And hydrogen is pretty flammable, right?
It's way flammable. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, and maybe we'll talk about it, I think there's a pretty famous instance of one of these like burning up, and it's like there's some like images or videos maybe of it just like
seared in your memory, right?
Yeah.
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 We'll talk about that in just a moment, because we have to talk about that. Zeppelins were employed in World War I for reconnaissance and bombing raids, although they moved pretty slow and they ended up being somewhat easy to shoot down. So certainly some people were killed by bombs from Zeppelins, but it was really airplanes that did more of that kind of damage. Initially, heaters were deemed to be too risky because of what you said. This is a highly flammable situation. And so passengers initially had to really bundle up to ward off the cold. Starting in 1929 and 1930, this company, this is amazing, used 2 Zeppelins to operate regular transatlantic flights from Germany to North America and to Brazil.
Wow. I never knew that. That's incredible. That would be really cool, actually, to do that.
Yeah. Because nobody had ever flown over the ocean before, the Atlantic, and this happened with the use of a Zeppelin. And here's something else that's amazing. The spire of the Empire State Building was originally intended to be used as a mooring mast for Zeppelins, so that the Zeppelin would come in, be tethered to the top of the Empire State Building, and then you'd get off of the 102nd floor and get onto your Zeppelin, which it's amazing to think about that. I mean, got to catch my flight. I'm going to Empire State Building. I can't catch my Zeppelin. They never did this, by the way, because the winds were just too unpredictable and too rough.
Still would have been incredible to see.
The Zeppelins did fly in really low over Manhattan and close to the Empire State Building. And that was a way of having everybody see this and sort of advertising what was going on. So one of these 2 transatlantic ships was called the Graf Zeppelin. It was 776 feet long. And in 1929, it was the first aircraft to cross the Pacific and circumnavigate the globe as well. So I think it took something like 21 days in a Zeppelin to go around the world. So this is a big first for people. The other transatlantic Zeppelin was even bigger than the Graf Zeppelin. It was 804 feet long, 134 feet in diameter, and was the largest human-made object that has ever been built that has flown. And the name of this one it was named after a former president of Germany. This is the Hindenburg.
Oh.
This is what you were
that's the name.
of. Yeah,
This is the one.
yeah, this
Yes,
is
I've
the
heard of
one.
it. Okay, this is the one I've heard of. Yeah.
So the Hindenburg conducted at least 10 transatlantic flights. And in May of 1937, it was coming into New Jersey, and the tail of the Hindenburg caught fire. And within seconds, the entire airship was engulfed in flame. The Hindenburg was using hydrogen instead of helium for what we talked about before, because the United States wasn't providing helium to Germany. There were 97 people on board and 35 were killed. So more people survived that disaster than died in that disaster, which is hard to imagine. But I mean, you've seen the picture, right? A lot of people have probably seen the
Right.
picture, and it's not super high up in the air, but you're thinking, how does anybody survive this?
Yeah, I've seen the picture, and again, I think I've seen like a rough video of it as well, and it's shocking. It's basically a huge mammoth fireball.
Yeah, apparently this airship coming in once again for a landing wasn't that big a deal, but some media were there just to see what was going on, and that's why these images were captured, is because there were actual some media there, and there's a transcript of somebody who's witnessing it and alarmed that this is happening. And so that's the footage that was played a couple hours later, and that's what people heard about this disaster when they were listening to their radios. And so after that, it was pretty hard to sell tickets on Zeppelins, and Zeppelins were used apparently in a really limited way by the German military in World War II. But by 1940, Zeppelins were no longer seen as viable. However, there's a new era of Zeppelins today. They're called Zeppelins NT, new technology. They're they use helium to become airborne, and this is something that was developed in the 1990s. So it's something that's sort of come back a little bit, but most people aren't traveling via Zeppelin even today, even with this new technology. And then now the Led Zeppelin thing. So how did this band get its name? There's a couple different legends, a couple different rumors. One story is that Jimmy Page, who's the lead guitarist, wanted drummer Keith Moon of The Who to be in his new musical project. And Moon said that he thought it would go over like a lead balloon. And so apparently that became sort of a badge of honor for the people who formed the band. And they decided that balloon wasn't big enough to capture the kind of failure they were risking. So they called their band Led Zeppelin.
Hopefully, at that point, knowing about the Hindenburg and everything that went on there, and sort of
Oh, yeah. No, I think
maybe like
there's
a little
got
play
to
on
be direct
the
reference
dramatic
there.
failure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So they were courting failure, but ended up being pretty popular, it turned out. So let's talk about heavier than air flying machines. And what we're talking about is early airplanes here that kind of developed from gliders. And so now it's time to talk about Orville and Wilbur Wright from Dayton, Ohio. Again, there is debate as to whether they actually flew the first motorized aircraft, although they do have pics, so they were able to prove that they did it. And Jeff, you might be interested to know that they originally, their first jobs, they ran a bicycle shop. They ran a bicycle.
I actually did know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Did we talk about that in our
It's
bicycle
very
episode? Why do I feel
possible.
like we talked about that?
These things are
But
starting
regardless,
to
I
run
knew that.
together.
Yeah, I knew that they were a bicycle company, which kind of maybe you can kind of see that same sort of, mechanical architecture, if you will, within their original airplanes.
That's right.
Of, how what they're using from the bicycle, right? So it's kind of interesting to see.
That's exactly right. And they did experiment a lot. They spent several years, I think 3 years, experimenting with gliders and how to fabricate it and how to control it. And they designed an engine that generated about the same power as two lawnmower engines to put on one of these devices. And they're generally credited with designing the first heavier than air aircraft, the airplane. In 1903, they made 4 flights of their engine powered Wright Flyer. This is the first one in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And even though from Ohio, they learned that the conditions might be really good. And there was this area where the conditions were good and there was a lot of sand. So if they had to land abruptly, that would cushion their fall a little bit. The longest of those 4 flights went 852 feet and 59 seconds. So by today's standards, that seems like not much, but that had not been recorded to have happened before. So that was a very big deal.
Right.
They came up with a few other iterations of the Flyer, including the Flyer 3, which in 1905, Wilbur piloted for 24 miles in circles for 38 minutes before he ran out of gas and landed safely. So that really encourage people that this is something that can happen. We can do this.
Right. I would be curious to know how much gas was on it for lasting for 24 miles. I mean, that's 24 miles in 38 minutes back then. That's you're going at a good clip.
I think that was one of the big challenges, is finding something fuel efficient to be able to keep going. And that, and some other pieces of technology, flight technology we'll get to in a moment, that was a limiting factor, having enough fuel
Mhm.
supply. But what's amazing is that if you think that, all right, maybe somebody beat them, but the earliest that this probably happened was 1901. We think 1903, the slightly longer flight in 1905. And then by World War I, they're using these things to help them fight wars. The people are using them in wars. And this is just a little over 100 years ago, 120 years ago. And look what we have now. It's astonishing, the progress that has gone on in a pretty short period of time. From 1905 to 1909, there's a French engineer named Louis Blériot who collaborated with others in constructing several iterations of a heavier than air vehicle. And in July 1909, he flew his Blériot 11 over the English Channel, because that's when you really want to make a point, right? You do something over the English Channel. So that's just, that's 5 years from that flight where they were going in circles for 24 miles, and somebody was able to pilot a craft over the English Channel, and orders started pouring in to this company that made this plane. And at the beginning of World War I, the most popular, or the most plentiful and the most common plane in the militaries was this particular airplane. And during World War I, just constant innovations going on with aircraft.
Right. It's not surprising to me that the military would see the strategic advantage of airplanes and air superiority. And that would then propel a lot of money and investment into research and development, and making sure that this technology, could then be used for enhancing your strategic, what's the word I'm looking for? Strategic advantage over your whoever you're warring with at the time. And that, I mean, I think this happens even to today, right? There's like a new jet out there, F-35 or something like that. That's apparently like the biggest, best jet in the world. And it costs like multiple billions of dollars to make. But it's something that's sort of built off of the same time period of like, just keep making them better.
Yeah, that's the idea, is to have the best, the most maneuverable, the fastest, the one that is least able to be detected by radar, all these kinds of things. And so, even though we've gotten to this, what feels like this super advanced moment of flight today, there's still ways to push that further and further. And that's still what people are engaged in. And then one more thing I want to mention here in terms of technology, which is the Concorde.
Oh, yeah.
Or
supersonic flights.
Yeah. Supersonic, right? Supersonic aircraft that already existed from the military, but this was now harnessed for commercial air travel starting in 1976. These machines sat 92 to 128 passengers, could travel at 1,350 miles per hour at an altitude of 60,000 feet. And this was a joint innovation between France and the UK. So Air France and British Airways were the ones who operated Concorde flights. However, there was one fatal accident which occurred in 2000, which was an absolute tragedy for the people on board and their families, and a public relations nightmare for the airlines that were running this. And so pretty soon they sort of took them away. And the other thing was that they were really expensive. So a London, New York round trip ticket on a Concorde in 1997 cost about $8,000, or in today's dollars, about over 14 grand. So this wasn't real practical for most people to pay. It was extremely loud. There was issues. And so the final flight of the Concorde was in 2003. And of course, there's a band called Flight of the Conchords from Wellington, New Zealand. They're a comedy duo that formed in 1998.
I've actually seen them live.
How was
interestingly enough? Very fun, very, very funny band. I really enjoyed the experience. I would say that given the cost of the Concorde, the actual airplane, supersonic jet, I'm not surprised that economically it didn't survive either, because it's probably it's traveling, approximately a little over twice the speed of a normal
That's
jet.
correct.
So you're probably saving, let's say, from London to New York, you're probably, normal, 6 hour flight. It's probably only going to take 3 hours instead. But that's multiple times more expensive. And I don't see where the cost advantage comes into play. That's a lot of money for not a lot of time savings.
Yeah, that's right. And apparently, Richard Branson offered to buy all the Concords off of these airlines because he wanted to use them, and they wouldn't sell them to him. And it just sort of these are on display in different places throughout the world now, but they're not using these things anymore. Take a breath, take a break.
All right, let's do it. We're going to hit our final ad break, and then we will wrap this episode up. We will be right back.
And we're back. It's the Geography is Everything podcast. Today we're talking about geography is air travel. And now we are talking about commercial air travel. So we've talked a lot about innovations in flight, all these different methods. And then we've got the airplane finally. But as of the 1920s, so less than a couple decades into the existence of airplanes, very few people flew other than pilots. It wasn't really common for most people to fly. And planes were also pretty small. They started making them bigger. We didn't have the jumbo jets of today that you could put a lot of people in. In the 1920s, however, air shows became very popular because there were all these pilots from the war. And so in the United States, for example, a lot of these pilots went and toured around the country and went to sometimes rural areas and put on shows. They're called barnstorming because they would set up their operation out of a barn and fly around. And there were a bunch of stunt performers who came up during this time.
Okay, that's pretty common. Like, there's still air shows today, and that's
Right.
sort of like one of the big shticks, right? And there's a whole thing called like the Blue Angels or something. It's like a whole
That's right.
pack and they fly jets or something, but that's their whole thing. They do like a bunch of air stunts
Yeah, they're pretty
here in the
impressive.
U.S. anyway.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
seen them flying over San Francisco a number of times, and they fly in formation, and it's pretty impressive. But what was going on in the 1920s was this very unregulated situation where you had people who were called wing walkers. And one of the famous one of these was Lillian Boyer, who in 1921 was working in a restaurant and met some people who came in and said, "Would you like to take a flight in an airplane?" She said, "Absolutely, I'd like to." And then so she took one flight, and then on the second flight, she climbed out onto the wing. And so this started her career as an aerial stunt woman. And she did many of her stunts without a safety wire. She was doing headstands on the wing. She climbed a ladder from a moving car into a biplane. Over 100 times she pulled this stunt, and all kinds of incredible things. There's some footage out there that it's hard to believe because how the wind isn't just taking her away. It's amazing to me. Now, most people's career as wing walkers had to come to a necessary end in 1929 because that's when the federal government in the United States decided to start regulating plane safety, and the heights, the low flying heights were largely not allowed. And so these new adoptions of policies made it so that this barnstorming thing couldn't go on too much more. A lot of Lillian Boyer's fellow aerial daredevils died young due to the extremely dangerous nature of the work. But Boyer lived to be 88. So she could still tell these stories after the 1920s until the 1980s about how she used to walk on wings. But there's a few other things that happened in the 20s and 30s which really captured people's imagination. And these were solo flights over the Atlantic Ocean, the first of which was flown by Charles Lindbergh in 1927. And he took a trip from New York to Paris, 3,600 miles, and it took 33 and a half hours because the planes weren't going as fast as the jet planes we have today. So apparently one of the big challenges for him was to stay awake for 33 and a half hours so that he could land the plane safely in Paris, which he did. And then a few years later, in 1932, Amelia Earhart, who set many records related to flight, became the first woman to fly solo over the Atlantic Ocean and the second person after Lindbergh. Nobody else did it in the interim period. And these flights did a lot to raise the profile of flying. And Earhart herself was a strong promoter of commercial flying. But I think it was in 1937 and the 1930s where Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, famously disappeared in the Pacific in an attempt to circumnavigate the globe by plane.
Right. I think that's very famous, very well known. And I think I think every few years you kind of hear about an article crops up that says something to the effect of, "Oh, this time they found, Amelia Earhart's plane, or
Right.
this time they found her wreckage," or something like that, and then it always kind of gets debunked, and so it's kind of become like this really fun mystery that's been adapted into a lot of different sort of works of fiction and sort of ideas of what could have happened. From UFOs abducting her to her and Noonan, I think, escaping and like eloping somewhere and just saying, we don't want to do this anymore. We don't want to be in the limelight.
Yeah, I mean, it's ripe for conspiracy theory for sure, right?
Right.
And there was so much attention on this person and on what they were doing. They were only 7,000 miles short of going around the world, and they just need to get across the Pacific in order to accomplish that feat. But that's of course not what happened. And after World War II, however, there was a huge boon in air travel. So if we look at statistics from the Smithsonian, in 1929, there were 6,000 passengers who who traveled commercially by air. And by 1938, it was 1.2 million passengers. So a huge increase. And then if you go further past World War, it becomes more popular. In the 30s, it was still really expensive. And so you had to be pretty wealthy in order to do that. And in the 50s, it was not cheap either. But in 1955, for the first time, more people traveled in the United States by air than by train. So train was the main thing. And then in 1955, I'm sorry, that was, I think, 52, 55, more people crossed the Atlantic in planes than they did in ships. So the 50s is when commercial airline really starts to kind of take over to a certain degree from ships and from trains. It's important to point out that in the United States in the 1950s, like most places, airports were segregated, racially segregated. And so discrimination in inferior airport facilities discouraged many people of color from traveling by air. If you see advertisements from this period of time, you're going to see white people in these advertisements. So it's sometimes called a golden age of air travel, but it wasn't really open to everybody. And also infamous during this time was the frequently degrading treatment towards female flight attendants during the mid-century and beyond. So this is wrapped up in power dynamics and patriarchy, which follows people to the sky. In the US, travel of jet planes, which were in addition to propeller planes, began in the late 1950s. And then in the 50s and the 60s into the 70s, we see fares start to become less expensive and more people are able to afford air travel. So the number of passengers between 1955 and 1972 increased by fourfold. So by the 70s, this becomes more common. Having said that, still most people flying are engaged in business, right? But over half, apparently nearly half the people in 1972 in the United States had engaged in air travel. So it's becoming, not everybody, but almost half. It's becoming more and more common.
That fact does not surprise me, because I think I read that up until the COVID-19 pandemic, most or not, maybe not most, but a lot of air travel was still done by business. And in fact, it was the business flyers and the business community that was kind of subsidizing the cost of flight for a lot of us, those of us who just travel for leisure. And that's at least been attributed in part to why plane tickets have gotten more expensive over the last few years, is because airlines can't rely on the business traveler now that there's things like Zoom or whatever, that people can record and talk to each other and have meetings and not have to be in person anymore.
Yes, certainly things have changed since COVID. But another big moment that probably we might want to mention briefly is September 11th, 2001.
Oh, right. Yes.
Right. And so this was a terrible moment in history where two commercial airline jets were purposely flown into the World Trade Center buildings. And things changed pretty dramatically for flight after that in terms of the experience of flying. So it was before then, you had to go through a metal detector, but you could go to the gate with somebody who was flying and bid them bon voyage from the gate, and you could wait at the gate when they came off the plane. And I remember this very clearly, that this was the thing. And of course, that all went away in the United States, but there are some places in the world that still operate that way. So I had some friends who were in New Zealand recently, and they said in New Zealand, it's still like that. They don't have the same kind of level of precautions that are being taken in the United States. Jeff, let's wrap things up by looking at some some top 10 type lists here because this is interesting. I'm going to talk about some of the busiest routes, air routes in the world today. So we have information from the Official Aviation Guide of the Airways, which is an organization headquartered in the United Kingdom. And we have information from 2023 now of what the busiest international flight routes by seat count are. And this data is for flights in each direction of these various routes. So I have a top 10 list I'm looking at. I haven't made this available to you on your notes so that you are forced to guess one of these routes on this list.
Sorry, are we talking domestic or international?
We're talking international. So not within any particular country, but from one country to another.
So I would say New York to London would be up there.
New York to London is number 8 on the list.
Okay. And then San Francisco to Tokyo?
That's not on the list.
That's not on the list. Okay, dang. What about, you know what would be a good one, I think, would be, what about like Los Angeles to Puerto Vallarta or Guadalajara or Mexico City or something like that?
That's a really good one, but that's not on the top 10 list either. I'm going to have to give you a hint at this point. The one that you guessed, New York to London, is the only one involving cities that are not in Asia on the top 10 list.
Oh, okay. Wow. So maybe then like Tokyo to Beijing?
I'm not seeing that on the list. I'm just going to have to tell you a couple of these.
Yeah, you're going to have to hit me with these.
The number one most traveled flight internationally in 2003 with 4.9 million seats was Kuala Lumpur, Indonesia to Singapore.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
I guess that's, thinking about it, that doesn't surprise me.
Mm-hmm. And Singapore is a huge place for business and probably for leisure as well. And Indonesia is probably, I think it's the 4th largest country in the world after the United States. Number 2, which was number 1 in 22, but number 2 in 23 was Cairo to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia.
That is surprising. I would never have guessed that.
Hong Kong to Taipei is number 3. Seoul to Osaka, Japan is number 4, and Seoul to Tokyo is number 5.
So my next guess was actually going to be Seoul to Tokyo.
Wow.
After Beijing. So close.
All right. So, that's interesting that, on this list, it's except for these 2 cities, New York and London, it's all cities in Asia that internationally have the most travel happening.
It's where most of the people are, right?
People live.
I'm actually surprised. Yeah, I'm not surprised that, there's not more, involving India. Maybe there's one or two, India too.
Actually, I'm not seeing India anywhere on this list. We got Dubai to Riyadh, Jakarta to Singapore, Bangkok to Seoul. So some of these same cities are involved over and over again. All right. What about the top 10 busiest airports in the world? Based on everything we've been talking about, what do you think the top 10 name me a couple airports you think make this top 10 list for busiest airports in the world?
Okay. I've heard that Atlanta is still one of the busiest airports in the world. Is it on the top 10?
It is number 1.
It is number 1.
Correct.
Okay, great.
That's right.
That is what I heard.
In fact, it's been the busiest airport every year since 1998, except for 2020, in which it was Guangzhou. So the Guangzhou International Airport in China. So COVID took that crown away from Atlanta for a year. Apparently, I saw a statistic that said Atlanta is within a 2-hour flight of 80% of the U.S. population.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've made some maps. I've done a little bit of data on this, but 80% of the United States population is within that sort of eastern 1/3 of the country.
That's
so
right.
That makes sense.
Yep. So Atlanta, number 1 on the planet. What do you think? What else could be on there?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and guess Guangzhou since you just met.
That is on there, but it's number 10.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. So steep drop off.
Yep.
I mean, number 2, I would guess would probably be somewhere else in China, Shanghai, maybe Beijing.
It's none of the airports in China.
Is it in Asia?
There are a few in Asia. I'm going to say 5 of them are in the United States. So we don't have the routes, but there are so many flights happening in the United States that 5 of the top 10 busiest airports are in the United States.
Okay, I'm going to list off Chicago O'Hare.
Yep, number 9.
New York's JFK and LAX.
Yeah, so LAX is number 8. JFK is not on this list. So We go from Guangzhou, number 10, Chicago O'Hare, 9, Los Angeles, 8, LAX, Istanbul International, number 7, Denver International, number 6, Dallas Fort Worth, number 5, London Heathrow, number 4. Now, there are 5 airports in the greater London area. And so if you include flights from all 5 of those airports, the busiest airport system in the world is in London.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, because there's like Gatwick
Yep.
and some other ones. Yeah.
Yep. And Tokyo Haneda. So a lot of times it's an international airport. A lot of people fly into Narita if they're coming from the West Coast, but Haneda Airport in Tokyo is the 3rd busiest airport, and then Dubai International Airport, number 2, and then Atlanta, we already talked about. There are over 40,000 airports in the world today. And to think about it, 120 years ago, there were 0. Now there's 40,000. The U.S. has more than any other country with over 15,000. And the U.S. state with the most?
Well, I would guess, I mean, this is based on my experience, but I would guess Alaska. And the reason why I'm going to say Alaska, Hunter, is because so much of their population is actually dispersed throughout the state in very small pockets. And the only way that anybody can get to them is by airplane. And so basically every little town, every little village actually has a FAA operated airport in it.
This is a great
Am I
guess.
right?
And unfortunately, I only have number 1. So but it's not Alaska.
It's not Alaska. Yeah.
It's Texas.
Okay. Well, yeah. This has been a very fun episode on air travel, Hunter. And I think it's about time to wrap this one up. So do you want to run through your whatnots?
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portland is a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left City is a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle with David Banis, and co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything.
Yeah, thanks, Hunter. My name is Jeff Gibson. You can find me, as a co-host here on this podcast, Geography is Everything, but also over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/geography by Jeff. You can watch little videos by me, just more geography content. If you liked what you heard today, you thought it was fun and engaging, please like and subscribe to us on YouTube or rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any other app that might use that sort of rate and review cycle system. Very fun to see those come in. If you want to find more geography by us, you can find us over on Substack. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com. And I guess, you can just sign up for the newsletter there. It's free. There's no charge or anything like that. Next week, we are kind of sticking with the same topic, although it's going to be a little bit of a different spin on it. Instead of doing air travel, we're going to do time zones, which is something frequently associated with air travel.
That's absolutely right. A lot of times you forget the time change, or that time change can have a big impact on your body. Perhaps we'll get into some of that.
We are absolutely going to get into all of that. It's going to be a really fun episode because time has a wacky geography attached to it, unlike anything else we've ever seen. So come back next week. We're going to learn all about time zones and sort of how time zones became a thing in the first place. It should be a really fun and engaging episode. So until then, we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening.